This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans. Anna is a Boston-based musician that has lived with gender incongruence her whole life. After trying medical transition, she decided to move away from this treatment approach for her condition, even after seeing some benefits. Regardless of her approach moving forward, she seeks to reestablish a new relationship with what it means to be a female, both physiologically and socially, at this moment in her life. Anna identifies as a feminist and someone in solidarity with transsexual people. And here's our conversation with Anna. All right, welcome back to Transparency. I am Aaron Terrell, and as ever, joined by my co-host, Aaron Kimberly. And we've got Anna here to tell us about her experience with dysphoria and whatnot. So thanks for being here, Anna.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation. I appreciate you being here.
Where we usually like to start is just kind of like at the beginning, with you chronologically, when you were young, and kind of what were your feelings around gender, or where did you first kind of start to realize that maybe you weren't experiencing girlhood like other girls?
Yeah, definitely. I can go way back. So my experience with gender dysphoria goes back to my childhood. It's something that I don't remember like not having. But I think when I was a child, I didn't really think of it as dysphoria initially, but it was incongruence. That's the way that I felt it. So it wasn't something that caused me um, a lot of distress, you know. So for instance, I presented as like the typical tomboy in terms of my general appearance. Um, Definitely partook in a range of gender neutral activities, you know. And so on and so forth, and really didn't feel like it was anything that I was doing was like necessarily out of sync or something until maybe like around first grade, second grade. That's when I started to realize things were getting a bit different in terms of how my body was changing, and also um, just like milestones that are like, for instance, I had like a first communion, and I was told to be put in a dress and be on the side with the girls, and things just started to not really make sense to me. I was like, wait a second, well, I'm supposed to be on that side wearing that stuff, you know what I mean? So things just slowly but surely, I was starting to get a little bit confused um, in the social aspect, and then in like the physiological aspect, right? So hitting puberty slowly but surely, and getting periods and stuff. um, I was just like, oh, as naturally as like a child would be kind of surprised by getting those things. There was like another layer to it where I was like, well, aren't I supposed to be getting what's happening to them? Like, you know what I mean? In terms of like looking at boys and being like, that should be happening to me, I'm guessing, you know. I had this kind of internal feeling. And I suppose that's when I would call it gender dysphoria, right? Because it started to become distressful, and I didn't know how to label it, and didn't really know how to talk about it. Um, and so, life went on. And I got through high school and started to get more into like the more like feminine like presentation and so forth, trying that out, and whatnot. And then continued on to college and so forth. And in the beginning of like my college studies, I learned about things like queer theory, and I started to get an understanding of the term gender dysphoria for the first time. Like I never heard that term until like my first year of college, from like my friends and stuff. And I was like, oh,
About what year
wow.
would that have been?
What year?
Yeah.
Um, Good Lord. I might have been maybe like 20, around 2018, maybe 2018.
Okay.
I'm 27 right now.
Okay.
So that was around that time. Um, and yeah, I was really surprised by the term, even though I grew up in a neighborhood that was like um I would say very liberal. Like I grew up in Chicago in like the Wrigleyville area, Boys Town area and stuff. And there's just language I've never like heard of before. And I was like, oh, let me investigate this a bit further and see what this is about. Um, and although like before that I knew about trans people, I didn't know that they transitioned to get to where they were in a particular way, like through like medical transition and whatnot, and et cetera, et cetera. I didn't understand like the underlying like certain realities of it all. And so I just started to like inform myself. And yeah, and then I went ahead with going into a medical transition um, a little bit before COVID hit. So there was definitely some gaps in my process.
Okay. And what? So you said you did kind of embark on transition, but then you decided not to go through with it, or I didn't realize you were basically technically a detransitioner in that case.
Yeah, so I would to some extent label myself in that way. So
Okay.
essentially what yeah, I mean it's so okay, let me explain.
Yeah.
I did go on hormone replacement therapy and I did go through a name change. I went by different pronouns for a while, both at home and in the workplace. And yeah, I did that for I think almost like a year. That was as much time as I had with that, and I experienced some changes like the deepening of the voice and so forth. And for me, the social transition was not something that felt very like different for me because my general way of like dressing and so forth and going about the world always has been kind of like on the more androgynous side. Um, I mean, obviously there were some challenges, but yeah, so I did, HRT. That's what I did. And I did see some of its benefits. I also saw some of like the limitations for myself and just noticed that there were just things where I needed some more information as to what I had, what I was experiencing. So
What information were you given at the time, if much of any?
yeah, so that's a really good question. So a lot of the information that I got about transition came from my own research and concluding like, okay, this is something that is like a medical move that I really need to consider at this point in my life, considering I'm getting older, and I am the way that I am. I have these feelings since I've been a child. And so a lot of the information that I got, for instance, I would get my HRT from Planned Parenthood. And so the information that I got there was that obviously I'm going to go through like physical changes, right? So I'm going to get the deepening of the voice, potential hair loss, and so on and so forth, and whatnot. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Obviously that's what you sign up for, right? When you start something like this. But there just wasn't, I felt like it was kind of like there was a consultation and then immediately um, I got HRT like in the next appointment, like not even, didn't get my levels checked, any sort of like hormone levels or whatever, didn't get like my mental health evaluated. And I was a little bit surprised by all of it. I was like pleasantly surprised, but also kind of like, this isn't honestly doesn't feel comprehensive at all, you know? So I embarked upon that and that was essentially as much information as I got. It was just kind of really, really plain, didn't go in depth. So
Did they ask you any questions at all, or were they just like, here's what information we have, do you have any questions for us, kind of deal?
Yeah, so they did ask me like what my pronouns were. They asked me um yeah, they also asked me like what my goals were with HRT. And I told them my goal is to transition into being someone who is presenting of the opposite sex, so a transsexual transition. And that was about it, you know, and there wasn't really any kind of like um, conversation, you know, it was just me being like this and that. And yeah, and that was essentially, there was no such, there wasn't like a thing like, oh, maybe, you know, you should look up, you know, we should look into like what the underlying cause is, or maybe we should run some additional tests. I kind of, um, I had an expectation that would be the conversation, that there would just be, it would just be more holistic, and that really wasn't it. So
So it sounds like it surprised you. Just the lack of discussion and information that happened. I mean, was part of your hope? Did you hope to better understand why you were experiencing what you were experiencing, or were you at that point, were you just ready to start hormones?
you know, it was both. I mean, I was definitely ready. Like I was at a moment where I was like, okay, I've been thinking about this, researching, you know, as much as I could on certain, you know, topics of transition for some time. I was also kind of like I had a, I would say, a moment where I really bought into some narratives around um gender dysphoria, like pop psychology narratives that were actually I think not the most positive in their essence, and that kind of put me in a position where I was like, I need to do this now, you know,
Mm-hmm.
just cognitively. Um, and so, yeah, I felt the need to do it immediately. And but likewise, did want information, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like gender dysphoria after, you know, doing my as much relatively superficial research. You know, I'm not like a scientist or anything. I'm just a person trying to understand a condition. There was just so much vague information initially that I found. It was just like, I don't know, it didn't feel really like helpful to me. And I just didn't know how to approach it, because if one is like, you know, at a point where they're, you know, about to go on hormones and stuff and so forth, even like having the cognitive headspace to like research things like that can be just overwhelming, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
And
because
yeah, it's a huge burden on the individual, right? You're already struggling, and I mean, if this was any other condition, we wouldn't rely on people having to research it themselves and then determine what the correct course of action is all on their own. And I mean, I struggle with this as a clinician, because I think what you're describing is quite common, that people do seek information on their own, make a decision on their own, sometimes do take their time to think about that. Others maybe rush that decision. So by the time people show up to a clinic, they've already often have made up their mind about something and want to proceed with the hormones. And I got a sense as a clinician in the position of meeting with these people, it's almost too late to provide them information. If they feel like the information they got from the internet was accurate and true and fits for them, and they've really hooked into that idea, it's almost too late then to educate them about what does the science actually say about these conditions. And with the community saying that some of those explanations are in fact offensive and transphobic, even though they're evidence-based, that people may have heard that as well. And then so as soon as you start to talk about what gender dysphoria is, people kind of shut down or they reject that message. And I think that's why it's so important for us to correct the public message and the message that's online as much as possible, so that when people are trying to find that information, that it exists somewhere.
yeah, yeah, definitely. What you just said, like there, I think there is definitely like a point where trying to inform people who are like into their transition to a relatively strong degree, and trying to I think like concepts in like queer theory narratives seem to really make it hard for people to potentially get an understanding of some like underlying causes as to why they have what they have. And that doesn't make them any less like trans, you know, it doesn't make them any less valid. But I think it might be really helpful from a mental health standpoint to be like, yeah, like physiologically, I can't turn into a male. You know what I mean? And just being conscientious, I think that's like a really big part of improving trans healthcare is being like, yeah, this is like what we are. These are the possibilities. These are, you know, what the reasonings as to why certain people get to a certain age and then they transition, which there's various reasons. And then just kind of like going from there. But right now, I feel like transition in our society, when people just kind of look at it from a superficial level, it's really mythologized,
Mm-hmm.
you know, even for people who have, you know, gender incongruence, gender dysphoria. I know from my own experience, you know, I really bought into just like a lot of slogans, you know, and I was like, yeah, I definitely, because for, you know, it's, if you have gender incongruence, it's like hearing these things, it's like a slogan like trans men are men, trans women are women. Like I think that is inherently transphobic, that slogan. And I know some people might challenge me on that idea, but I think there's something about it where it's like it's trying to erase um what transition really is, you know, and the humanity of trans people as trans people, if you see what I'm saying.
Mhm.
So that was something that I've encountered, and just kind of like being like, okay, you know, I don't know. It's there's so much to it all. So I
Yeah.
gonna start rambling, but
Yeah, there's sort of for a long time have been these two warring positions. I mean, the trans activists insisting, you know, that literal sex change is possible, or that we should at least think of it that way, and then the radical feminists who really object to even the concept of gender dysphoria or incongruence, because they say, well, no, I mean, a woman can be more masculine, and that's still a woman, and therefore they don't like that terminology incongruence, that you're not, no woman is more like a man, is how they would rationalize. And I feel like both of those positions really erase and undermine what we're actually experiencing. I mean, a sense of incongruence is why many of us are gender nonconforming. It's not, I mean, yes, I know that it is a natural variation of your own sex, you know, in those cases, but it's really not understanding that our desire to be, or our mistake in thinking we are the opposite sex, is the whole point. Like that's what incongruence is. And so I think both of those positions, I think, erase the reality of our experience, and I would prefer to keep both of them out of our understanding of what gender dysphoria is, and keep it evidence based.
yeah, you know, they're both pretty extreme approaches, right? And it kind of yeah, definitely. I agree with you on that. Like keeping that stuff out is super important, because the like just when people get too political, and then it kind of meddles with the science that we're trying to refine, you know, or trying to just get a more comprehensive understanding of. Um, yeah, then you know everybody loses, right? Like both trans people and non-trans people. So
Mm-hmm. So
Speaking of
without
those
much help
two
to make
different
sense. Sorry, go ahead.
you're good. So speaking of those two, like kind of the two, they're almost two contradictory understandings of transness, for lack of a better word, that you were kind of touching on, with where we got that the queer theory framework, right? And then I think what you were alluding to was kind of like the born in the wrong body framework. And do you recall which one of those like made more sense to you, that you latched onto? Or I know for many of us it's kind of like whichever one makes us feel better given the in the given moment, whichever is going to be the best answer to the current question. But yeah, I'm curious what your kind of position on those two. opposing forces was.
Yeah, as in like, do you mean like what I gravitated to
Yeah.
most?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the born in the wrong body narrative, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. I internalized that on a very strong level at a certain point when I was like transitioning. Um, and yeah, I think that's a very damaging narrative for trans people. Because I dated, I dated someone who was trans at the time, a trans woman, and I felt that that narrative was also internalized by this person, and had, have friends who are trans, and that gets internalized by some people in a certain way, and it's terrible. I think it's a terrible narrative, and I don't think it's true.
Yeah, there's no evidence that it's true. I mean, James Cantor wrote a paper sort of compiling some of the MRI evidence, and he said, and he wasn't saying that it's ever true, but he said if there was a case to be made for a kind of like a brain intersex condition, or a brain trending towards the opposite sex, he said it would only exist in the homosexual cohort. I mean, that's been established in literature, that we can see, not necessarily on an individual level, but on a group level, we can see sexual orientation in the brain, and that gay men's brains tend to trend towards female, and some gay women's brains trend towards masculine, but that hasn't been the case in the heterosexuals who transition. So it is a falsehood, but I mean, as you discovered, there's a lack of accurate information available online. So the only two narratives that are really being presented to people with gender dysphoria is either the queer theory framework or the gender identity framework of born in the wrong body. There's really no alternative. And when the only times that they ever maybe hear something like autogonophilia, it's used as a slur by some people, as this is just an awful thing, and if you have this, you're disgusting, or a complete rejection of the concept, as though it's been completely debunked. And those are the only two ways that concept tends to be presented to the public. So who would want to identify into that, or who would even entertain the thought that maybe that's what's going on for them? And that's really a shame, because I think we all benefit from better understanding what's going on for us, and what motivates us, and allowing that to factor into our decision making about how we want to manage it and move forward.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, there definitely is some sort of taboo with concepts like autogynephilia, auto-androphilia, and so forth. And I think honestly, a lot of it comes down to is just like the way that the words ring. They really kind of sound similar to other paraphilias, and just have like a weird vibe to them, honestly. And right, a lot of the research that exists is kind of like shamey in the way that it's written. I don't know, from what I've read. But yeah, it's definitely important. And I've been in a context a few years back where I did like there was like a mental health like peer support group for all people who were like trans or like gender nonconforming and so forth. And there was no discussion about these concepts like at all, and just looking back now, being like, wow, there are these like clinical settings that mental health settings that just maybe are not even aware of these conditions, or don't even know how to like present these possibilities um to patients, right? To people dealing with certain things, and not making it a thing that's like rooted in like shame, you know. So
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a couple
Yeah.
reasons why it's so thoroughly rejected. Because, like you said, yeah, the wording of it is like most people, when that suffix ophilia, most people, it's usually preceded by pedophilia, right? That's the one that's so ingrained culturally. And so when you hear something that sounds like that, it's immediately like that's awful. And when it's a shame, because it's Yeah, it's a sexology terminology, and actually, if you break down like love of oneself as a woman, that's kind of poetic. It's like it's not gross or shamey. It's kind of like that's, but yeah, just the word itself. But the reason I think it's most fervently rejected is because it does rely on the person experience it being their actual sex, and that's what they reject, right? It's like to be auto-androphilic, you have to acknowledge. Well, sorry, to be auto-gynophilic, the one that we actually for the most part know exists. The other one is where sexologists don't recognize its existence. I disagree with them on that, but that's a topic for another day. But like the autogynephilia, it's a male's propensity to want to be a woman, right? And so it relies. The very foundation is this is a male experience, and that's what they're so fervently rejecting. And they'll say it. It's like, oh, well, I reject it because it basically rests on the premise that I'm male and I'm not, and that's yeah. So it's two reasons
Yeah.
why it's so yeah.
And not only male, but a male with a fetish. I mean, that people frame it as, well, this is just a fetish, and I think that reduces down the concept. It's a difficult concept. I've tried really hard to understand it and try to empathize and understand what that would be like to experience, but to reduce it down to it's just a fetish. I mean, that just makes it sound like it's all about arousal, and I think that's also a barrier in people, identifying that in themselves. They think, well, I'm not just some sicko that gets turned on all the time, and because I think of fetish as, I don't know, bondage gear or licking shoes or something, right? They don't think of it's far. I think it's so much more complex than that, and the experience of it is far deeper and probably subconscious and complex, that that framing really prevents people from seeing that, okay, well, that concept actually does explain what I'm experiencing, and the full range and depth of that experience.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, right? Because I don't know if fetishes or, with like autogynephilia, autoandrophilia, it's something where it's like, I guess people have like shifts, and but it's something that is retained like more consistently than like a fetish, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I feel like fetishes are something that people can like um maybe control in a particular way, or just I'm not sure. I don't know. But
It's
yeah,
hard to articulate the difference, isn't it? But it's,
yeah,
yeah.
there's something about it that is different, right?
I think I
If
think
people kind of
I
yeah,
think what it is it's kind of with paraphilia, maybe not a paraphilia. So I have a hard time thinking of autogynephilia. I feel like maybe we're making a categorical error because it seems so much more like a sexual orientation, because it's so rooted in the person's sense of self, like their entire self perception is based in this sexual proclivity, whatever. And it's so like a fetish is more like, okay, somebody's being turned on by spanking or whatever. It's like that's a kind of mild one, but that's a fetish. That has nothing to do with their sense of self or how they move through the world or identify. Whereas like like having an auto-sexuality is good. It's entirely it's kind of your entire personhood. I mean, not to make it like that. I don't know. I don't know how else to put it, other because it's like it's not something that you can just separate to the act of sex, right? It's in kind of all encompassing, which is very different than a fetish would be.
And yeah, and I think one of the differences too between a sexual orientation, as you say, and just a thing or an activity that turns you on, is the degree to which it influences your social behavior as well. I think, a lot of people thought of gynephilia, they have a compulsion um, to live that out in the world and interact with others. And, so it influences social behavior in a way that, if, like, to use your example, Aaron, to just like being spanked. I mean, you can contain that action to a relationship or in private or the bedroom, but when something is a whole orientation, and I would include heterosexuality and homosexuality in that, it interacts with your personhood to the degree that you want to express it to other people.
Exactly.
yeah, I definitely I agree with that, And one thing that I think is interesting, and I want to know more about, is like the onset of autogynephilia and autoandrophilia in terms of, so there's people who have, you know, like early onset, like gender incongruence, right? Like when I was a kid, I was like not sexually attracted to like anyone, you know, and even when I was like middle school, teenage, like I didn't really have that to myself, you know, like that just wasn't a part of me. Um, and yeah, I think with people who have like autoandrophilia, it's more like it's less erotic in certain ways potentially, and it's more what's the word that I'm looking for? Um, maybe not like empathetic, sympathetic. I'm not sure how I'm trying to
I
word this.
so I've talked about in other episodes is I feel like my experience of gender dysphoria is probably rooted in what is autoandrophilia. I don't have another way to explain it, but the way that I would say what you're saying is it was much more sentimental than erotic. Is how it was experienced for me. If again, if this is a thing, it's is very much more, yeah, kind of identifying with boys and men. And I didn't make the same kind of categorical error that it sounds like you, when you were quite young, you were making the same kind of categorical error that Aaron did. Whereas like, what do you mean I'm supposed to be in the girl category? I'm supposed to be in the boy category. Like it was a subconscious. And it sounds like it even extended into when you were approaching puberty, which is that's pretty ingrained, right? If, like that, so I had I'm real so some of my earliest memories are my most kind of semi-traumatic memories was I would sneak into my brother's dresser. It sounds like such a typical like autogynephilic story, but it obviously had nothing sexual whatsoever. It's just like I grew up in a very conservative Christian home and I wanted to wear the boys' clothes, but I wasn't allowed to. So it's like the sneaky thing that I did was go and steal my brother's clothes. But yeah, there's absolutely nothing sexual about it. And even as I um, grew older and I started to confuse the feelings of attraction, and also like you, I didn't experience allosexual like any sexuality until late teenage years. Um, but and then when I did, it was always confusing. Attraction and envy. There was no distinction between those two things. I'm not sure if that's anything you can relate to as well, but so it wasn't like I was ever turned on by the idea of being a man. It was just like it seemed absolutely necessary, I guess. Um, I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah, but well, what you mentioned, the whole attraction slash envy thing is definitely a relatable experience, you know. And yeah, it's I don't know what it is. It never was like a really mean-spirited thing, but it was like, oh my gosh, like I should like be like that. Like why? You know, it's just really weird, especially as a child. And then also, you know, the whole thing of like going into my dad's closet and my brother's closet and taking their clothes consistently. And then taking my brother shopping and being like, you should wear this. You know, I'm like, yeah, like,
You're
I actually
living
want to wear
vicariously.
it. Yeah, so it
uh,
was, you know, like that. Definitely relatable stuff. But yeah, it's so interesting to me because I would definitely consider myself someone who like later on in my life, like currently, I can see that there are aspects of like auto-androphilia, right, within my own like behavior. Um, which I'm not going to get into like too much, but it's something that I think is like if because autogynephilia is more so talked about like males, right? But autoandrophilia is like I don't know. I've ran into people and I'm like, wow, you're more than like I'm more than sure you're autoandrophilic. Like I could like feel it. You know what I mean? There's something about that, and I could see it in myself. And I think there's even more taboo and shame than like autogynephilia.
really?
Um, I think so. I think because it's just I don't know. I looked online, for instance, like there's all sorts of like AGP communities and, you know, people like sharing information, and then auto-androphilia. It seems like it's something that, I don't know if it's because it's just like rarer, or which I personally, I don't know if that's the case, but it's just not talked about as much. Like it's hard to find more information about it, in the way that like it's easy to find stuff about AGP. And maybe
Also,
that's
never,
only been my
never,
experience, but
yeah.
maybe you guys have a different experience. So
Well, it's never been researched and established in the literature either. So I think, I mean, as much as trans women reject the idea, there are some, I mean, because that, at least that diagnosis has been established, some have been able to access that information and then discover that that applies to them. Whereas I don't think women are afforded that opportunity because it's never been studied. It's never been established as a diagnosis. And so there's really nowhere you're going to stumble upon that information and identify it as, oh, well, that kind of fits with my experience.
right, definitely.
Women in
There's
general are understudied. It's just sort of assumed that every study that applies to men also applies to women. I think that was the mistake made as far as even the homosexual cohorts, that the gay men that were transitioning, I mean, they were fairly well studied. And I think it was just assumed that all the butch lesbians also fit into whatever was true about the gay men was also true about the lesbians. And I don't think that's a fair conclusion to draw, and it really does need to be studied.
Definitely, yeah, I definitely agree with that.
And yeah, and I think there's another. So yeah, that doesn't exist literally. Like it's never been studied. It's never been an established pattern in sexology. But so that's one reason. Another reason is I think for autogynephiles, the feeling is so powerful and so obvious. It's kind of hard to ignore. I mean, obviously, the people who don't want to accept it say, "Oh, I get turned on by this because I'm supposed to be a woman, and this is normal female sexuality." It's like they talk themselves around it, but they know very well what's happening, right? Whereas it's not. It's going to be much more subtle and less apparent, to the person experiencing autoandrophilia than it would be to the person experiencing autogynephilia. It's going to be much more. It's like I've been studying this for what, like, I guess in earnest, 3 years now, and it took me until a few months ago to be like, I think that is what I experience, and I was having a completely open mind to it the entire time as well. So it's not because it's just so. I think because of another part of that is my allo external gynephilia is so very much real that that was another part where I was like, I can't really confirm that this explains my dysphoria. So that's another kind of element to it. But then if you just like kind of spend time in FTM communities online, there's a lot of what we could easily categorize as autoandrophilia being discussed there. They just don't know what that word is. They don't, and I think, and that, to me, it seems obvious that the butch lesbians who transitioned and then started sleeping with men, being androphilic externally, that to me, it's like, I don't have another way to explain that besides autoandrophilia, that they had internalized an idea of themselves as male, and the way to express that was to date women. And then when they could externalize them being male by the testosterone and whatnot, then they could act on their actual androphilia, is my theory on that phenomenon. But again, the gynecologist, the sexologists just say, no, women don't have paraphilias. And it's like, okay, well then what's going on? You tell me.
Which I think furthers your thought that maybe this isn't a paraphilia, right? Maybe
Right,
then
right.
maybe an inversion of a sexuality is different than a target location error.
That's my hunch. Yeah.
I think another part of it is like with autogynephilia, like a male dressing in like feminine clothing is very like, visually obvious, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just due to like design realities, right? So the way that clothing is designed for females is significantly different than for males, which I think is kind of stupid. But anyways, yeah, it's easier to see. And then if for people who have auto-androphilia, I think it's easier to get away with it without being very obvious. You know what I mean? In like a
Mhm.
public setting. And that's one thing that isn't really recognized, but I think it is a prominent thing.
Mm-hmm. So you ultimately decided not to medicalize, and so how have things been for you since then? How are you managing it, and does the idea of medicalization never still come up for you, or do you feel like you've kind of thought that through and they felt like that just wasn't going to be helpful for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I've definitely had instances where I have gone back and thought about it, where I've been like, you know what, this was helpful to me to a certain extent. There's different variables that I've taken under consideration, which is, I would say, I think I want to get a more comprehensive understanding as to what I have on like a clinical level, especially being someone who has had this since childhood and really, like I got into my teens and I was like, oh, I'm a female. Like I had to like make myself aware of that, even though obviously I was aware of my body. But processes like this make me very curious. And so I want to get as much information as possible at this point in time. So the way I'm navigating gender dysphoria, gender incongruence is first and foremost, trying to get some medical answers and seeing if there's maybe something behind certain things. So there's evidence that there's like conditions, like intersex conditions, that there's hormonal imbalances, et cetera, genetic realities that may contribute to situations like my own. So I'm curious about that. I know if I were to like go on hormones, that might, I don't know. I don't know what that would do. So I want to get the most comprehensive answer possible in a particular time frame, and just get a really clear understanding as to what it's like to be really open about my reality, and not medicalize. So for me, that's mental health care, taking care of my mental health, and making sure I talk about everything that I experience with someone who has. It's hard to find people who have experience with like gender dysphoric patients, but don't press like either gender affirming care or like conversion therapy stuff. It's a really weird kind of world that we live in that sense. So yeah, leaning into mental health care is big for me. And just seeing where it goes from there, just taking things day by day. So the
Have you
way I
looked into?
dress, honestly,
Oh, go
the
on.
way I dress and present in the world, it's like it's not really, I mean, there's differences from like when I was like on T, and doing HRT and so forth. But besides that, I'm just, there are days that are harder than others. There's like weeks that are harder than others where I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is just insane, because my whole body feels different and so forth. And I'm just like, wow, this is weird. People don't have this, but people do, and just being like, all right, I'll see where it goes from here. So that's kind of my approach. Yeah.
Are you aware of the GETA therapy network at all? Aaron, you might know more about this, but I think it was GenSpect who put together, or if GETA is independent, I'm not sure. But basically, just a network of therapists who are gender exploratory, right? I wonder if anybody if you're aware of any of those therapists, and I'm wondering also if any of them are actually that informed on the various types of gender dysphoria. And I'm starting to wonder about that because I know their whole position is not pushing affirmation and medicalization, but I'm wondering if they actually, what if they have solid alternatives, solid understandings of the experience of dysphoria, and yeah, I'm curious about that actually.
Yeah, I've looked into it. I've
Okay.
done some research into like different modalities, so I'm very interested in pursuing that. I've been pursuing kind of like a standard like CBT kind of oriented therapy, but obviously there's some things that have to be looked at differently, I think, with a clinician, with someone like myself. So I'm definitely interested in doing things like that right now, for sure.
Other than your own internal struggle, which we all tend to experience, would you say that your incongruence is causing problems for you in other domains of your life, like relationships or your ability to work and go to school or just function in day-to-day life?
Yes, I would generally, yes, it does that. I think it was more prominent when I was really buying into like popular narratives about being trans. That's when it was a real struggle. And it interfered with my work life, interfered with my, personal relationships and everything. And so that heightened my gender dysphoria indefinitely. I think today in particular, it's something where I can recognize what's going on, and I can be like, okay, this is what I am. This happens, and I try to use my feelings of gender incongruence to my advantage, which might sound kind of weird, but like for instance, I work in the arts. I work in arts education currently, and I'm also doing like a part-time thing in the military. So it's like I try to kind of use some of the feelings that I have and in my relationship with my body in order to help me do better occupationally. So
Give an example of that. I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
yeah, I know that's a really kind of vague thing to say. So for instance, when I was um, in training, in military training, I have it's gender incongruence and also just a sense of like body dysmorphia. I think that kind of trickles into that I have, and just kind of accepting, like there's certain moments during the month where I feel more dysphoric than other times, and I become more energetic and so forth, and just more intense. I get really intense, and I kind of leaned into that, and when I had to do things in training, I kind of exploited that and was like, this is okay, this is not a bad thing. This is something that I can use in this context,
That makes sense.
Does
Okay.
that
Yeah.
make a little bit of
That
sense?
does make
Yeah.
sense. Yeah. Yeah. Now I'm wondering, do you experience that? Uh, this is something that Phil Illy, a repeat guest, and I'm sure you're familiar with Phil as well. But in his research on autogynephilia and autoandrophilia, he believes that there's this kind of a psychic shift that can happen for some people, where it's almost like they're embodying, or like they're in their mind. It's like there's again, he says, it calls it a psychic shift, where it's like you've got a kind of like a male kind of personality versus a female personality. I'm not really sure if I'm explaining this properly. It's something I don't experience, so I don't fully understand it. But I'm wondering if you have, if that's kind of what you're experiencing.
Yeah, I think yeah, I think it's something that's like it's for me, it feels like a physiological, like subconscious thing that starts to like occur. And then I can lean into it or not lean into it. So I think that kind of describes my shift. So I definitely believe there are people, I don't think maybe all people that have gender incongruence or dysphoria experience this. As you've said, it's something that you feel like you don't relate to, but I think it's real for some people. And I definitely, that's something that I'm trying to lean into, and see it's like, I think it's a positive quality to the gender incongruence and just seeing what I can do with that, even though it's not consistent, right?
Well, anything else we go over?
Yeah, I think honestly that's in terms of my gender dysphoria experience, that's essentially it. I'm someone I've had it since childhood. I'm really interested in knowing more about it and treating it in alternate modalities. So
Yeah, it sounds like you have an incredibly introspective and just really thorough understanding of what you're experiencing, in a way that yeah, most people who don't probably don't understand it as well, but mostly don't care to understand it as well. So it's really kind of inspiring to kind of hear how like thoroughly you're investigating this. And yeah, I
I
would hope
think there's
most people.
Sorry, I
Or
think there's plus and minuses to it, when people do a lot of investigation on their own, into gender dysphoria. There's definitely benefits to being like, okay, this is the situation, and just, transitioning and following through on a full transition. I think that can, be good if it's done right, with the right support, the right endos, and the right, general community support. But there's also, I don't know, there's so many ways to go about it. So
one thing I wanted to kind of dive into a little bit before we let you go is the kind of, let's go back to the AGP dichotomy here, the AGP HSTS male dichotomy, and they say that like little boys who are dysphoric, the AGP ones pray that they were girls. The HST ones think that they're girls. Like, it's not something that they hope for or wish for. It's just like an error that they're making. I was definitely of the kind of, I knew I was a girl. I just wished I was a boy. I thought that there was a mistake that was made. I wanted nothing more than to just be a boy, even though I was fully aware of the fact that I was a girl. So that very much aligns with the kind of, the AGP side, right? And then, Aaron, you were, kind of the classic female HSTS. You made the categorical error of not like, oh, I wish I was a boy, but literally thinking that you were. And Anna, it sounds like you were doing the exact same thing. It sounds like you have the, and again, I don't think that these dichotomies are necessarily entirely accurate, and then they certainly don't directly correlate to the female version of this, but it is quite interesting that you had that kind of quintessential HSTS dysphoria experience where, and using that acronym, homosexual transsexual experience of making that categorical error, and yet you grew up to be entirely androphilic. Is that correct?
yes, I think that probably, I describe myself, so sexually, I describe myself as a bisexual, if that kind of helps. But yeah, I think androphilic is something I do identify with to a certain extent, but the whole scenario of identifying as a boy just automatically from childhood is such a real part of my experience. When I got older, I was like, I wish to feel normal. It's not like, you know, um, I don't know. It was interesting. I definitely identify with the whole being a boy thing.
All right. Anything else
Well,
you wanted
thanks.
to go over?
I think that's it. Thank you so much for having me and for us, discussing this interesting topic of gender dysphoria and incongruence and so forth. So I appreciate the time.
Thank you so much for being
I,
here. It's been
yeah, I
excellent.
appreciated you sharing your story, and you articulate it so well. So I think it'll be very helpful for other people to hear it.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.